70 men loved
years,
her.
poured coffee and
All
filed
7
papers.
died. They called her
Invisible,
cursed,
forgotten,
until a
just part of
stranger
the
came to
furniture.
town with a
When
blind
Margaret
father
rose
and a
finally
buried
stood
truth.
to speak. The most powerful men in the state
The cemetery
fell
in Cedar
silent
Falls had
because
7
they
stones
had no idea
that
who
shouldn't
they were
have been
really
there.
dealing with.
Not because they weren't properly buried, not because the paperwork was wrong, but because each one represented a young man who had died loving Sarah Coleman. 7 stones, 7 names, 7 reasons why the good people of Cedar Falls crossed themselves when she walked by. Sarah knew every grave by heart, could recite the dates without looking, could tell you exactly how each man had died: accidents, illnesses, tragedies that struck like lightning from a clear sky. Michael Henderson, 1975. Motorcycle accident 3 days before their wedding. James Murphy, 1977. Heart attack at 24, healthy as a horse until he wasn't. David Price, 1978. Oil rig explosion, first week on the job. The list went on, each name a weight on her soul. Each death a confirmation of what the town already knew. Sarah Coleman was cursed. She walked through downtown Cedar Falls like a ghost among the living. People stepped aside. Conversations stopped. Mothers pulled their sons closer. The preacher's wife actually hissed once low and sharp like she was warding off evil. "It's not natural," they whispered. 1 man, maybe 2, you could call it coincidence. But 7, that's the devil's work. Sarah heard it all, felt every stare, carried every whispered accusation like stones in her pockets. At 28, she was beautiful in the way that made men stop and stare until they learned her name. Auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight, green eyes that held depths most people were afraid to explore, a smile she rarely used anymore because it seemed to promise things that ended in funeral parlors. She lived alone in the house her grandmother had left her, a white Victorian at the edge of town where the pavement turned to gravel and the gravel turned to dust. Nobody visited anymore. The mailman left her letters at the end of the drive. Even the door-to-door salesman passed her by. Sarah had stopped believing in love, stopped believing in hope, stopped believing that she deserved anything but the loneliness that had become her constant companion. That morning, the morning everything changed, she was kneeling in her garden, pulling weeds that grew faster than flowers, when she heard the trucks rumbling down Highway 6. Not unusual. Cedar Falls was a crossroads town. People passed through all the time, heading to Austin or Houston or anywhere that wasn't here. But these trucks stopped. Sarah looked up from her tomatoes to see 2 vehicles parked outside Murphy's Diner across the street. A beat-up Ford pickup, sky blue with rust spots. Behind it, a newer Chevy truck pulling a small U-Haul trailer. 3 men climbed out. The first was older, 60s maybe, moving carefully like someone navigating by sound rather than sight. The second was younger, late 20s, with strong shoulders and gentle hands that stayed close to the older man's elbow. The third man was different, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore simple clothes, but carried himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sarah watched them disappear into the diner, then returned to her weeding. Strangers came and went. They always did, but they never stayed. And they certainly never looked twice at the cursed woman in the garden. Except this time was different. An hour later, the younger man appeared at her garden gate. Up close, he was even more striking. Sandy hair, blue eyes, a face that spoke of honest work and honest intentions. He stood at the gate like he was waiting for permission, hat in his hands. "Ma'am," his voice was respectful, kind. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for someone who might know about the Coleman family, old banking records. I was told there might be someone." Sarah's hands stilled in the dirt. "I'm Sarah Coleman." Something flickered across his face. Not fear, not the usual withdrawal she was accustomed to seeing, just interest. "I'm Tobias Brennan, Toby, from Oklahoma." He gestured toward the trucks. "That's my father, Frank, and our guide, I guess you'd call him, Ray. What do you need to know about the Colemans?" "My grandfather left some money in a bank here, years ago, before he died. We're trying to claim it, but the paperwork," Toby shrugged, "it's complicated." Sarah studied his face. He was looking directly at her, not through her, not around her. but at her, like she was a person instead of a cautionary tale. Which bank? First National, downtown. Sarah almost smiled. That bank's been closed for 3 years. But I know where the records went. You do? I should. I used to work there. Toby stepped closer to the gate. Could you maybe help us? And there it was. The moment Sarah had been dreading for 7 years. Another man asking for her help, another opportunity for disaster to strike, another chance for death to prove that some people were meant to be alone. She should have said no, should have sent him away, should have protected him from whatever dark force seemed to follow her like a shadow. Instead, she heard herself saying, "I'll get my keys," because sometimes, even cursed women get tired of being afraid. And sometimes, just sometimes, the eighth time is the charm. Toby smiled, really smiled, like she'd just offered him the moon. "Thank you, Miss Coleman. You don't know what this means to us." But as Sarah walked toward her house to get her purse, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to find out exactly what it meant, and that this time might be different. Behind her, she heard Toby calling to his companions. "We found her, the Coleman woman. She's going to help us." The older man's voice carried across the street. "Praise God. I told you Ray would lead us to the right person." And from the third man Ray came a response that made Sarah's skin prickle with something that wasn't quite fear. "She's exactly who we've been looking for." Sarah paused at her front door, key halfway to the lock. Exactly who they'd been looking for, not just someone who could help with bank records. Specifically her. For the first time in 7 years, Sarah Coleman felt something she'd forgotten how to feel. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, beautiful hope. Bloco 2, desenvolvimento e tensão 800 for 1,000 palavras. The First National Bank building stood empty on Main Street like a monument to broken promises. Its windows were boarded up, its sign faded by 3 years of Texas sun. But Sarah had a key. "How do you still have access?" Toby asked as she led the 3 men around to the back entrance. "Because when they closed, someone had to organize the safe deposit boxes and old accounts. I volunteered." Sarah turned the key in the lock. Seemed like fitting work for someone people avoid anyway. The door opened into darkness and the smell of dust and abandonment. Sarah flicked on the emergency lighting, bare bulbs that cast harsh shadows across rows of empty desks and filing cabinets. Frank Brennan moved carefully beside his son, one hand on Toby's arm, the other trailing along the wall. "Feels bigger than it sounds," he said. 3 floors originally," Sarah explained. "But the vault and records are down here." Ray, the silver-haired man who watched everything with those unsettling wise eyes, studied the abandoned bank with obvious approval. "Perfect, exactly what we need." "For bank records?" Sarah asked. Among other things, there was something in his voice that made Sarah's skin prickle again. Like he knew more than he was saying. Like they all did. She led them to the vault. Still massive and imposing, even though it now housed nothing but boxes of paperwork instead of money. "What was your grandfather's name?" "Samuel Brennan. He would have opened the account sometime in the 1950s. Sarah pulled out a ladder and began searching the high shelves where the oldest records were stored. As she climbed, she could feel Toby watching her. Not the way most men watched her, with a mixture of desire and fear. Just watching. Steady and calm. "Found it," she called down, pulling out a thick folder. "Samuel Brennan. Account opened 1953. She climbed down and spread the papers on an old desk. The emergency lighting cast golden pools of illumination in the surrounding darkness. "Here," she said, pointing to a ledger entry. "Savings account, never touched, with interest." She did quick calculations. Should be worth about 15,000. Now, Toby whistled low. "That's more than we hoped." Frank gripped his son's shoulder. "That money could pay for your sister's college, maybe even buy back some of the farm." "Sister?" Sarah asked. "Anna. She's 17. Smart as a whip, wants to be a doctor." But after Dad's accident, Toby trailed off. "What accident?" "Industrial chemicals. Blinded him 6 months ago. We've been trying every treatment we can find." But Toby's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah could hear the pain underneath. She looked at Frank's unseeing eyes, remembering her own catalog of losses. "I'm sorry." "Not your fault," Frank said gently. These things happen, do they? Ray spoke up quietly. Or do they happen for a reason? All three of them turned toward him. In the harsh lighting, his face seemed almost to glow. What kind of reason? Sarah asked. The kind that brings people together when they need each other most. Ray smiled mysteriously. Toby needed to find this money. You had access to the records. Frank needs healing. And you. He looked directly at Sarah. You need to remember that love isn't always a death sentence. Sarah's blood went cold. What did you say? I said love isn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it's salvation. How do you know about? Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. About the 7 men who died loving you. Ray's voice was gentle, compassionate. Because that's not the full story, is it, Sarah? There's more you haven't told anyone. Sarah felt the familiar walls rising, the instinct to run, to hide, to protect herself and others from whatever darkness followed her. But Toby stepped closer. What's he talking about? Sarah looked at this kind, honest man and saw Michael Henderson's face, James Murphy's smile, David Price's laugh. 7 faces, 7 graves, 7 reasons to walk away. I should go, she whispered. Sarah, Ray's voice stopped her at the vault entrance. What if I told you that those men didn't die because they loved you? What if they died because something was trying to prevent you from finding the right love? That's crazy, is it? 7 men, 7 tragedies. 7 times you were left alone right before you could build a life with someone. What are the odds? Sarah's hands were shaking now. You don't understand. I bring death. I always have. No, Ray said firmly. You've been protected from the wrong deaths so you could find the right life. Toby looked between them, confused. What are you people talking about? Sarah took a shaky breath. Every man who's ever tried to marry me has died. 7 of them. The town thinks I'm cursed. Toby was quiet for a long moment. Then, do you think you're cursed? Sarah looked at him, really looked, and saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. Not fear, not pity, just curiosity. I don't know what I think anymore. Then maybe, Toby said carefully, it's time to find out. That evening, Sarah did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She invited people to dinner. Her grandmother's dining room hadn't seen company since the funeral of David Price. Sarah had to dust off chairs and wash dishes that had been sitting unused in cabinets. But as she cooked, really cooked, not just heated up something, for once she felt a stirring of something that might have been joy. Frank sat in the living room, listening to the radio and asking questions about the house, the town, her life. His blindness made him safe to talk to somehow. He couldn't see the way people usually looked at her. Toby helped set the table, moving around her kitchen with easy familiarity, like they'd been doing this dance for years instead of ours. And Ray watched everything with those knowing eyes, occasionally nodding like pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. This is nice, Frank said during dinner. Feels like a real home. It was, Sarah said. My grandmother raised me here after my parents died. She always said this house was meant for families. What happened to your parents? Toby asked gently. Car accident. I was 12. Sarah cut her chicken carefully. Gran used to say I was spared for a reason. She was optimistic about God's plans. And now I think maybe God's plans include a lot more suffering than Gran wanted to admit. Ray set down his fork. Or maybe God's plans include more salvation than you're willing to believe. After dinner, Toby helped with dishes while Frank dozed in the living room and Ray stepped out onto the porch for air. He's unusual, your friend Ray, Sarah said, handing Toby a plate to dry. He's not exactly our friend, more like our guide. He showed up right when we needed help most, kind of like an answer to prayer. Do you believe in that? Answers to prayer. Toby considered this. I believe in providence. Things happening for reasons we don't always understand right away. Even bad things. Maybe especially bad things. He dried another plate. What if those 7 men died not because you're cursed, but because you were meant for something else? Someone else. Sarah's hands stilled in the soapy water. That's a dangerous thought. Why? Because if you're wrong, and something happens to you, then at least I'll have had tonight. This dinner, this conversation. Toby moved closer. Sarah, I don't believe in curses, but I believe in love. and I believe in fighting for what matters, even if it kills you. Even then, that night, after the men had returned to their hotel, Sarah sat on her porch and counted stars. 7 years of loneliness stretched behind her. 7 graves in the cemetery bore witness to her fears. But for the first time in years, she was thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday. Inside the house, the phone rang. Sarah almost didn't answer. Phone calls after dark never brought good news, but something, intuition, maybe, or desperation made her pick up. Sarah. The voice was panicked, familiar. "This is Jenny from the hotel. There's been an accident." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. "What kind of accident?" "The older man, Mr. Brennan. He fell down the stairs. He's unconscious. They're taking him to the hospital now." The phone slipped from Sarah's numb fingers. 7 men. Now it would be 8. And this time, she'd brought it on herself. Asterisk. Cedar Falls General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Sarah burst through the emergency room doors at midnight, still wearing her dinner dress, her hair coming loose from its careful bun. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and desperate. Toby sat in the waiting area, his head in his hands. When he looked up at her approach, his eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. "How is he?" Sarah asked. Though she already knew, she always knew. Conscious now. Concussion, maybe some internal bleeding. They're running tests. Toby's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the fear underneath. "The doctors say it could have been much worse." But it wasn't worse, not yet. Sarah sank into the chair beside him. "Toby, you need to take your father and leave. Tonight." "What?" "Get in your truck and drive back to Oklahoma and never look back. Forget about me. Forget about the money. Just go." Toby stared at her. "You think you caused this?" "I know I caused this. 7 men, Toby, 7. And now your father slipped on wet stairs at a cheap hotel. That's what happened. That's what always happens. Accidents, coincidences, random tragedies that aren't random at all." Sarah was crying now, ugly tears that she'd held back for years. "I should never have let you help me. Should never have invited you to dinner. Should never have what?" Ray's voice cut through her hysteria like a blade. She turned to find him standing in the hospital doorway, still wearing the same simple clothes. But somehow he seemed larger, more present, like he was taking up more space than his physical body should allow. "Should never have started caring about someone again," Sarah whispered. Ray walked over and sat across from them. In the harsh hospital lighting, his eyes seemed to hold depths that went beyond human understanding. "Sarah Coleman," he said quietly, "do you want to know the truth about your 7 dead men?" "I already know the truth." "No, you know the fear, the guilt, the story you've told yourself to make sense of senseless pain, but you don't know the truth." Toby looked between them. "What truth?" Ray leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "The truth is that Sarah was never cursed. She was protected. Those 7 men died not because they loved her, but because their love for her wasn't strong enough to break through what was really trying to destroy her." "That's impossible," Sarah said. "Is it?" "Tell me about the dreams, Sarah." Sarah went rigid. "What dreams?" "The ones you've had since you were 12, since your parents died. The dark figure that whispers to you at night, telling you that everyone you love will die, that you're poison, that you should be alone." Sarah's mouth fell open. She had never told anyone about the dreams. Not her grandmother, not any of the 7 men, not even the pastor when she'd tried confession years ago. "How do you?" "Because I've been watching over you your whole life, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone strong enough to break the real curse." "What real curse?" Toby demanded. Ray looked at him steadily. "Your father wasn't the only one blinded by chemicals, Toby. Sarah was blinded too, spiritually. Made to see death where there was meant to be life. Made to fear love where there was meant to be joy." He stood up, suddenly seeming less like a helpful stranger and more like something altogether different. "Sarah, the night your parents died, they were driving home from a church meeting. Do you remember what that meeting was about?" Sarah shook her head, but something was stirring in her memory. They were planning a mission trip to help people. Your father was going to give up his job, sell the house, take the family to serve in places where people needed hope. Ray's voice grew stronger. But something didn't want that light in the world. Something that feeds on despair and loneliness and fear. You're talking about? Toby's voice trailed off. I'm talking about an enemy that's very real and very determined to keep people isolated from love. An enemy that killed Sarah's parents to traumatize her, then spent years convincing her that love equals death. Sarah was shaking now. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. Your father is still hurt. Just like all the others were good men, Ray interrupted. But they weren't the right man. They weren't strong enough to fight for you when the real battle came. When love was tested by fear, he looked directly at Toby. But this one is different. Different how? Tell her, Toby. Tell her what really happened at that hotel. Toby frowned. I told her. Dad fell down the stairs. Tell her the rest. Toby was quiet for a moment. Then, there was a man in the hallway when it happened. Tall, dark coat, just standing there. When Dad fell, this man smiled. Actually smiled. Then he just disappeared. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Disappeared. How like he was never there. But I saw him, Sarah. I saw him watching Dad fall. And he was glad about it. Ray nodded grimly. And what did you do then, Toby? I prayed. Right there in the hallway while the paramedics worked on Dad. I prayed harder than I've ever prayed for anything. Toby looked confused. I prayed that whatever was trying to hurt my family would have to go through me first. And I felt, I don't know how to describe it, like something huge and invisible was suddenly paying attention to me. Like I'd just declared war on something I couldn't see. Ray smiled, really smiled for the first time since Sarah had met him. Exactly. You declared war. And that changes everything. A doctor emerged from the examination rooms, looking tired but relieved. Mr. Brennan, your father is going to be fine. Mild concussion, no internal bleeding. We'd like to keep him overnight for observation, but he should be able to go home tomorrow. Sarah slumped in her chair. He's okay. But that doesn't make sense. They always die. Ray finished. But this time, someone was willing to fight for you instead of just loving you. This time, someone looked evil in the face and said no. Sarah looked at Toby with new eyes. You really did that. Declared war on whatever this is. I declared war on anything that tries to hurt people I care about. Toby took her hands. Sarah, I don't understand half of what's happening here. I don't know if Ray is some kind of angel or just a very wise man. I don't know if there are actual supernatural forces at work or just a lot of bad luck and psychological trauma. But I know I'm falling in love with you. And I know I'm not going to let fear yours or mine stop me from fighting for that love. Sarah searched his face. Even if it kills you, even then. But Sarah, what if it doesn't? What if this time, love wins? That night, Frank Brennan slept peacefully in his hospital bed. The doctors said his concussion was healing faster than expected. His vital signs were strong. He kept talking about strange dreams of light. He said, warm, golden light that seemed to be healing something more than just his injuries. Sarah sat beside Toby in the hospital chapel, a small room with simple wooden pews and a stained glass window depicting the Good Shepherd. I'm scared, she admitted, of me dying, of you living, of this working, of having something good and then losing it. She leaned against his shoulder. 7 years of being alone changes you. I know. But Sarah, what if 7 years of being alone was just preparation for a lifetime of being together? She looked up at him. Do you really believe that? I'm starting to. They were married 3 weeks later. Not in the big church downtown. Sarah couldn't face that many stares and whispers, but in the little chapel at the hospital where Frank had recovered. So miraculously, Ray performed the ceremony, producing official credentials that no one questioned, but everyone somehow trusted. The wedding was small. Frank, fully recovered and seeing better than he had in months. Toby's sister Anna, who drove down from Oklahoma, and declared that anyone who could make her brother smile like that was family. A few of Sarah's elderly neighbors who remembered her grandmother fondly. And something else was there too. Something that felt like blessing instead of curse, like protection instead of threat. Do you, Sarah Coleman, take this man to be your husband in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in joy and in sorrow? Until death do you part. Sarah looked into Toby's eyes and saw her future. Not a series of graves and goodbyes, but a life built on love stronger than fear. I do. And do you, Tobias Brennan, take this woman to be your wife, knowing that love sometimes requires fighting battles you can't see, defending what matters against forces that would tear it apart. Toby's voice was strong and clear. I do. Then, by the power vested in me by God and the state of Texas, I pronounce you husband and wife. They kissed to the sound of applause and tears, and something that might have been angels singing. That night, in the bedroom Sarah had never shared with anyone, she lay in Toby's arms and waited for disaster to strike. At did in single quotes t. Instead, she fell asleep to the sound of his heartbeat and dreamed of light, warm, golden light that chased away shadows she'd carried for 28 years. And in the morning, when she woke up beside a living, breathing, very much alive husband, Sarah Coleman, Brennan finally understood what Ray had been trying to tell her. Love isn't a death sentence. Sometimes it's resurrection. 6 months after the wedding, Frank Brennan's sight returned completely, not gradually, like the doctors had predicted with their experimental treatments, not partially, like even the most optimistic prognoses had suggested, but fully, perfectly, like someone had simply turned on a light switch in a dark room. He woke up one Tuesday morning, blinked twice, and said to his son, Toby, you need a haircut. The medical team in Austin was baffled. The nerve damage that had seemed so permanent, so irreversible, had somehow healed itself. They wanted to study him, write papers, understand the mechanism of such an unprecedented recovery. Frank just smiled and said, sometimes miracles don't need explaining, they just need accepting. But the real miracle wasn't the return of sight to a blind man. It was the transformation of a woman who had learned to live in fear into someone who chose to live in faith. Sarah bloomed like a flower that had finally found sunlight. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes for 7 years faded, replaced by a contentment that made people stop and stare, not in fear this time, but in wonder. She and Toby bought the old house next to her grandmother's place, connecting the properties with a gate in the back fence. Frank moved into the original house, declaring that a man who'd been given his sight back deserved a porch where he could sit and watch sunsets properly. Cedar Falls, never quick to change its opinions, slowly began to revise its understanding of Sarah Coleman Brennan. It started with small things. Children no longer crossed the street when they saw her coming. The mailman began leaving packages at her door instead of at the curb. Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store actually smiled when Sarah came through the checkout line. Funny how different she looks when she's happy, people began to say. Maybe it wasn't a curse after all. Maybe it was just bad luck. Or maybe, suggested the pastor's wife, who had once hissed at Sarah like a cornered cat, maybe we were so busy looking for demons that we missed an angel walking among us. The real changes, though, happened in the quiet moments that only a marriage can create. Sarah learned to trust sleep again, knowing she would wake up beside someone who chose to stay. Toby discovered that healing someone else's heart could mend wounds in his own that he hadn't even known existed. They worked together in the garden, planting vegetables and flowers that would bloom for seasons to come. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching Frank teach neighborhood children how to identify birds by their songs. They planned for futures that extended beyond the next potential tragedy. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk about children. Are you sure? Sarah asked one evening as they walked through town, past the cemetery where 7 stones still stood, but no longer seemed to accuse her. What if we have beautiful children who grow up knowing they're loved? Toby interrupted gently. What if we break every generational curse and start a legacy of blessing instead? What if I'm still broken in ways we don't know about yet? Toby stopped walking and turned to face her. They were standing under the streetlight in front of the old bank where they'd first worked together, where her transformation had begun. Sarah, do you remember what Ray told us about those 7 men? That they weren't strong enough to fight for me. That's part of it. But he also said they died so you could find the right love. Not just any love, the right love. The kind that's strong enough to build something lasting. Sarah looked around at the town that had once felt like a prison, but now felt like home. And you think that's us? I think we're proof that God specializes in taking what looks like a curse and turning it into a blessing. 7 graves became the foundation for one beautiful life. They were married for 2 years before Sarah became pregnant. She spent the first trimester convinced that something terrible would happen. Miscarriage, birth defects, some new tragedy to prove that happiness wasn't meant for people like her. Instead, she glowed, actually glowed, like some inner light had finally been given permission to shine. Frank took pictures constantly, documenting every stage of a pregnancy. That seemed touched by grace. Stop worrying, Toby would tell her when he caught her reading medical books about everything that could go wrong. This baby is already loved by more people than most children get in a lifetime. He was right. The entire town of Cedar Falls seemed invested in Sarah's pregnancy. Women who had once crossed themselves at her approach now stopped her on the street to offer advice, share stories, touch her growing belly with reverent hands. It's like watching a miracle unfold in real time. The pastor's wife confided to her husband, "That girl has gone from cursed to blessed." Before our very eyes, Samuel Frank Brennan was born on a Tuesday morning in October, healthy and perfect, and possessed of his grandfather's eyes and his mother's smile. Sarah held him for the first time and wept not from fear or loss or the anticipation of tragedy, but from the overwhelming reality of joy. "He's beautiful," Frank said, seeing his grandson with the vision that had been restored through grace. "He looks like hope made flesh." Ray appeared at the hospital that afternoon, carrying a small wooden box and wearing the same mysterious smile he'd worn the day he'd first guided them together. "For the baby," he said, placing the box in Sarah's hands. Inside was a simple silver cross on a delicate chain, old but polished to a warm shine. "It belonged to your grandmother," Ray explained to Sarah's shocked expression. "She asked me to make sure it reached the right child at the right time. You knew my grandmother. I've known your family for generations, Sarah, watching over you, waiting for the moment when love would be stronger than fear." Toby looked up from where he was gently rocking his son. "Are you really an angel?" Ray's smile widened. "Does it matter what you call me? What matters is that you chose love over fear. You chose to fight instead of surrender. You chose to believe that some stories have happy endings." He kissed the baby's forehead gently, and for just a moment, the room seemed filled with golden light. "His path will be different from yours," Ray told Sarah. "He'll grow up knowing he's wanted, loved, protected. He'll never doubt that good things can last. And the whatever it was that tried to destroy my family, defeated, not by supernatural power, but by human choice, by a man who decided that love was worth fighting for, and a woman who decided to trust again." Ray moved toward the door, then paused. "There will be other children, other blessings. This is just the beginning of what God can build on the foundation of redeemed love." He disappeared down the hospital corridor, and Sarah never saw him again. But she didn't need to, because everything he had promised came to pass. 5 years later, Sarah stood in the backyard of their expanded home, watching Toby push 5-year-old Samuel on the swing set they'd built together. Their 2-year-old daughter, Grace, played in the sandbox nearby, chattering happily to herself in the way small children do. Frank sat on the porch, his sight still perfect, reading a story to 3 neighborhood children whose parents had learned that the Brennan house was a place where kids were welcomed and loved. The garden Sarah had once tended alone now sprawled across both properties, vegetables and flowers growing side by side, tended by the whole family. The gate between the houses stood permanently open, creating one large space where love could expand without boundaries. "Mama," Samuel called from the swing, "tell us the story again." "Which story?" "Sweetheart, the one about how you and Daddy got married." Sarah smiled, settling into the chair beside Frank. It had become Samuel's favorite bedtime story, though she told a simplified version, appropriate for young ears. "Well," she began, "once upon a time, there was a sad lady who thought she could never have a family because of the bad dreams." Samuel added, pumping his legs to swing higher. "That's right, the bad dreams that made her forget that good things could happen. But then one day, a brave man came to town with his daddy, and they needed help, and the angel man was with them." Grace chimed in from the sandbox. "And the angel man was with them," Sarah confirmed. And the brave man wasn't afraid of the sad lady, even when everyone said he should be. Because love is stronger than fear. Both children chorused, because love is stronger than fear. Sarah agreed, catching Toby's eye as he pushed Samuel's swing. He winked at her, and she felt the same flutter in her stomach that she'd felt the first day he'd appeared at her garden gate that evening. After the children were asleep and Frank had retired to his own house, Sarah and Toby sat on their porch swing, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" Toby asked, referring to the peaceful solitude Sarah had known before their whirlwind life began. "Never," Sarah said without hesitation. "I spent 7 years in quiet. It nearly killed me. And now I know the difference between loneliness and solitude, between silence and peace." She curled closer to him on the swing. "This is peace." Toby was quiet for a moment. Then, "I got a letter today from a man in New Mexico. Says he heard our story somehow, and his situation is similar to what Dad's was. Wants to know if we can help. Another blind man, another family that's lost hope." Sarah considered this. Over the past 5 years, word had somehow spread about Frank's miraculous recovery. They'd gotten calls, letters, even visits from people facing similar situations. Sometimes medical help was possible, sometimes it wasn't. But always, they offered what they had learned. Sarah considered this. Over the past 5 years, word had somehow spread about Frank's miraculous recovery. They'd gotten calls, letters, even visits from people facing similar situations. Sometimes medical help was possible, sometimes it wasn't. But always, they offered what they had learned, that love combined with faith could move mountains. "What do you think?" Toby asked. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that maybe our story isn't finished yet. Maybe it's just expanding to include other people who need to know that curses can become blessings, even if it means traveling, taking the kids on the road sometimes." Sarah laughed, a sound that would have been impossible 7 years ago. "Toby Brennan, I spent most of my life afraid to leave my own front yard. Now you're suggesting we become traveling ministers of hope, something like that." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars and thinking about the woman she used to be, isolated, fearful, convinced that love was synonymous with loss. Then she thought about the woman she had become, wife, mother, friend and neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid her, a woman who had learned that the darkest chapters of a story don't determine how it ends. "Yes," she said finally. Yes, let's help them. All of them. Anyone who needs to know that 7 years of darkness can become a lifetime of light." Toby smiled and kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Mrs. Brennan. I love you too." And Toby, "Yeah, thank you for fighting for us, for not giving up when everything seemed impossible. Thank you for letting me fight, for trusting that this time could be different." They swung gently in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of a life fully lived, children's toys scattered in the yard, Frank's radio playing softly from his porch, the distant sound of neighbors calling their own children in for the night, normal sounds, family sounds, the sounds of a curse that had been transformed into the deepest possible blessing. 10 years later, Brennan Family Ministry had become legend throughout Texas and beyond. Not because they performed miracles, though Frank's restored sight and Sarah's transformation from town pariah to beloved neighbor certainly qualified as miraculous, but because they offered something rarer than supernatural intervention. They offered hope backed by living proof that the worst chapters of a story don't have to be the final chapters. They traveled in a converted RV during the children's summer breaks, visiting families who had written or called for help. Sometimes they could provide practical assistance, connections to doctors, financial help, prayer support. Sometimes they could only offer their presence and their story. It was always enough. Sarah, now 38, had grown into the kind of woman people instinctively trusted with their deepest fears. She could look at a wife whose husband had been diagnosed with terminal illness and say, "I know what it feels like to believe love equals loss. Let me tell you about another possibility." Toby had developed a gift for seeing through people's stated problems to the real issues underneath. The man who seemed to need medical help for his failing eyesight actually needed permission to grieve the son he'd lost. The woman asking for prayer for her troubled marriage really needed someone to tell her That surviving trauma doesn't make you responsible for causing it. Frank, now in his 70s, but still possessing the perfect vision that had been restored 15 years ago, had become the ministry's unofficial grandfather. Children flocked to him everywhere they went. Adults found comfort in his gentle wisdom and his living testimony that God's timing is often different from human expectations. Samuel, now 15, and Grace, 12, had grown up understanding that their family's story was both ordinary and extraordinary. They knew their mother had once been considered cursed. Their grandfather had been blind. Their father had fought invisible battles for love. But to them, these weren't miraculous stories, they were just family history. The real miracle, they understood, was the daily choice to trust love over fear. On a warm October evening, the 10th anniversary of Samuel's birth, the family gathered on their expanded porch for their traditional celebration dinner. The table was crowded now. Sarah and Toby, Frank, the 2 children, and 3 visiting families who had come seeking help and stayed to become friends. Tell us the story, demanded 6-year-old Emma, whose parents had driven from Arkansas after her father's industrial accident had left him blind. Which story? Sarah asked, though she already knew the angel story. How you and Mr. Toby met the angel. Sarah looked around the table at the faces illuminated by candlelight and solar lanterns. The technology had changed, but the warmth remained constant. Well, she began, as she had hundreds of times before. Once upon a time, there was a woman who thought she was cursed as she told the familiar story. Sarah caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of their property line. Tall, distinguished, silver-haired, wearing simple clothes, but radiating an unmistakable presence. Ray, he raised one hand in a small wave, smiled that mysterious smile she remembered so well, then turned and walked into the darkness. Sarah's voice never faltered as she continued the story, but her heart filled with gratitude for the stranger who had guided them from curse to blessing, from fear to faith, from isolation to the kind of love that expands to include everyone it touches. And they lived happily ever after? Emma asked when the story ended. They lived joyfully ever after, Sarah corrected gently. Happy is just a feeling. Joy is a choice. What's the difference? Happy depends on things going well. Joy decides to be glad even when things are difficult, because it knows that love is stronger than any problem we might face. Later that night, after the guests had gone to their rooms and the children were asleep, Sarah and Toby sat in their bedroom, preparing for sleep. I saw Ray tonight, Sarah said quietly, at dinner. After standing by the fence, he waved, then disappeared. Toby smiled. Checking up on us, I guess. Making sure we're using our blessings well. And are we? Sarah looked around their bedroom at the photos of their children, the letters from families they'd helped, the simple wooden cross that had belonged to her grandmother hanging on the wall. I think we're trying. I think we're learning that miracles aren't just about what God does for us, but about what we do with what God gives us. Toby turned off the light, and they settled into the comfortable silence of a marriage built on trust, tested by trials and strengthened by shared purpose. Toby, thank you for being brave enough to love a cursed woman. Thank you for being brave enough to become a blessed one. Outside their window, the Texas night was full of stars and possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families needing hope, new opportunities to prove that love really is stronger than fear. But tonight, Sarah Coleman Brennan, wife, mother, and living testimony to the power of redeemed love, slept peacefully in the arms of the man who had been brave enough to fight for her heart. And in her dreams, she danced at weddings instead of standing beside graves, because that's what happens when curses become blessings. And blessings, once received, are meant to be shared. It's still standing souls. We believe that's what every redeemed story is meant to become, not just a personal victory, but a testimony that others can use to fuel their own faith. Not just an individual blessing, but a family legacy that extends blessing to everyone it touches. Because somewhere tonight, someone is counting their own graves. Someone is convinced that they're cursed, that good things aren't meant for people like them, that love is too dangerous to risk again. Someone needs to hear that 7 endings can become one beautiful beginning. Someone needs to know that the darkest chapters of their story don't have to determine how it ends. Someone needs to meet people like Sarah and Toby, people who prove that when love is brave enough to fight and faith is strong enough to endure, miracles don't just happen, they multiply. Your story isn't over yet. Your 7 graves might be the foundation for one beautiful life. Your curse might be a blessing that just hasn't been unwrapped yet. Join us at Still Standing Souls, where every broken heart has the potential for redemption, every impossible situation has room for miracles, and every person who refuses to give up becomes a light for others. Walking through darkness. Subscribe now, because love that's strong enough to fight is strong enough to win. And when love wins, everybody wins. Still Standing Souls. Real stories, transformed lives, lasting hope.